Taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
Now you burst on the scene with The End of Faith, and more recently you've published Letter to a Christian Nation. And on the basis of these two books and on the kind of attention they generated, I kind of half imagine you having a business card that says Sam Harris, atheist, right? I mean, that's very much your persona.
Yeah.
Is that okay with you, or?
No, well, it's ironic that I never thought of myself as an atheist before I wrote The End of Faith. I never even was made aware of the atheist foundations in this country and the atheist think tanks. And as I argue in Letter to a Christian Nation, I don't think atheism is a term we need, and it's not a name that anyone really needs to answer to.
Because well, what does it mean to you exactly? Is it somebody who's sure there's no God, or?
No. It's somebody, in the same way that somebody's sure that there's no Zeus, you can be sure that there's no God of Abraham. It's not the kind of certainty that says we have proved the absence of this thing.
Yeah.
It's just that there's no good reason to believe in this thing. And so the reason why I object to the term atheism is that we don't have terms for people who don't accept astrology, for instance. You don't have to wake up in the morning and define yourself around this variable, I'm not an astrologer, I'm not an astrologer. And you don't join a club for non-astrologers. You just use reason and evidence and common sense. I mean, these are the only terms I think you need, or the only schemas you need to resist the claims of astrology. And so when an astrologer comes forward and says this isn't an exact science, you ask for evidence, and when the evidence is not forthcoming, you dismiss these claims. And I think we can do the same with theistic religion.
Okay, so strictly speaking, it's kind of the same as agnosticism as it's commonly understood, in that you're not completely sure of the absence of any God.
Well, it's not agnosticism in the sense. I mean, I think Bertrand Russell clarified this with his famous teapot argument. Can you prove that there's a China teapot in orbit around the sun? No. Or can you disprove the existence of this teapot? No. Well, then is it reasonable to be an agnostic about this teapot? Well, not really, because there's just no good reason to believe that there would be a teapot in orbit around the sun. So it's basically that's the lens I look at it.
You're more sure that the Abrahamic God doesn't exist, or that a benevolent and omnipotent God doesn't exist, right, because there's so much suffering in the world, than you are that nothing that could remotely fit the description of a deity exists.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And you're unlike some people who would call themselves atheists, I think, in that you profess to take spirituality very seriously, mm-hmm, and to even have a spiritual life yourself, I gather.
Yeah.
Which I think you would say is a kind of mysticism.
Yeah, and I've used these terms, spirituality and mysticism, somewhat interchangeably, but I've used them in scare quotes because they come freighted with a lot of baggage that I think is unfortunate and somewhat embarrassing and hard to defend intellectually. And I've received a lot of grief from atheists for the final chapter of The End of Faith, where I talk about spirituality and mysticism. But I think there's no question that human beings there's a range of positive human experience that we can call spiritual or mystical, for lack of better words, because it tends to be accessed only by people who go into caves for a year and pray or meditate. I mean, who take extreme steps, almost invariably within a religious context, to discover what they can discover about their own consciousness using various techniques of introspection. And there's no question that there is a there. Now, whether you can make metaphysical claims about the universe on the basis of those experiments, I think we can doubt.
There's a there in the sense that a number of people have experiences that sound similar. There are unifying themes in the experiences of a lot of people. And if you had one of these experiences?
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time practicing meditation in kind of traditional silent retreat settings where all you do is meditate for 18 hours a day. You don't read, you don't write, you don't talk. And I've done this in comparison with real great mystics. I've done this for a very short period of time, but I've done it for probably 2 years in total, in like 1 to 3 month increments. And
2 years worth of extended retreats of a week or more.
Yeah.
That's intense.
Yeah, and it's just a matter of getting your toe in the water, really. I've had teachers who
I've done 1 week's worth,
Uh-huh.
so I get the idea,
right,
and it was worthwhile. But 2 years is a lot.
Yeah, well, it was 2 years probably spread over 10.
No, still.
Yeah.
You were staying in touch. And do you still meditate?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so describe the experience or some experiences you have that convince you that there's something true about mysticism.
Well, there's a whole range of what are generally called conditioned meditation experiences that are experiences that emerge by virtue of how you're using your attention, and they're quite temporary because they really are dependent on you being very concentrated and not distracted by anything in your environment or your thoughts. And these aren't really the center of the bullseye as far as I'm concerned in terms of mysticism. I mean, you get a lot of bliss and rapture, and you can have visionary experience, and this is most of what is described in the literature on meditation, because it's you can talk a lot about it. But the more subtle stuff that within Buddhism goes by the name of emptiness often is not really best categorized as a kind of phenomenal experience. It's really recognizing the status of every experience. So it's coincident with ordinary waking consciousness. Nothing radical, no fireworks have to go off in you for you to have this kind of mystical experience. And it's really, it's simply the experience of ceasing to feel yourself separate from your experience. I mean, we go through life feeling like not only are we having an experience, we are somehow the center of it. We're the watcher of the experience. We're the thinker of the thoughts. We are appropriating the flow of experience moment by moment. So there's almost, we don't feel merely identical to our bodies. We feel like we're riding around in our bodies as a kind of a separate subject. And that, I think, can be easily demonstrated, although it can take some doing for a person. It can be easily demonstrated that that's a false point of view, and that you can lose that sense of separation, and you can lose the sense that you are a locus of consciousness riding around behind your eyes, looking out at a world that's separate from yourself. And that loss is often called non-dual awareness or emptiness in some context.
The collapse of the subject-object distinction.
Yeah, and it's very freeing, because so much negativity hinges upon maintaining that distinction. Fear, anxiety, hatred. I mean, all of that is predicated upon feeling a very strong sense of I on one side and object on the other.
Yeah. So in the End of Faith, you actually describe the collapse taking place in a situation where you're kind of looking at the inanimate world, or you're reading a book and suddenly you realize kind of, you are the book, or maybe that's a caricature, but the distinction between you and the book begins to dissolve.
Right.
But you didn't talk, I think, about the distinction between you and another person collapsing, which is where the moral dimension becomes prominent, right? But is that's equally a part of the experience, or has been for you?
Yeah. Well, the connection between mystical experience and morality, I think, is very interesting and somewhat difficult to sketch out. I mean, one point of contact is that when you look at the states of mind that make good meditation possible, they're not the morally repugnant states of mind. I mean, hatred and deception and scheming against others, and selfishness and self-concern. I mean, these obscure. They stir up thoughts. They make it very difficult to pay attention to what you need to pay attention to in order to realize emptiness or any of these other subtler states. And it just so happens that states like loving kindness and compassion and devotion and just inner peace, just feeling like you're not racing to the next moment in your life. That's a very good basis from which to have these insights. And there's a feedback, because then these insights kind of reconfirm those states of mind. So you get, some of the great meditation masters I've met, they don't tend to be cantankerous, self-absorbed, megalomaniacal people. They tend to be very loving and compassionate and easygoing people. And I don't think that's an accident, and that is a kind of an affective or emotional basis for an ethical life. You know, when your default setting is to be concerned about the happiness of others, and to be concerned about their unhappiness, in the presence of their unhappiness, to feel an urge to alleviate, you know, their suffering. That is, you know, that's an ethical life, and then we can write our ethical codes on top of that. But
yeah, so, I mean, it makes sense to me that, you know, you would expect natural selection to create creatures that are self-interested, and that perspective would pervade you in your normal waking life. But it wouldn't necessarily represent moral truth, and it seems logical that to get past that would take some sort of radical measures in terms of discipline, meditative discipline, or you know, chemicals that have yet to be invented or something. Right. So it makes sense to me. So there is in this a little implicitly some ideas about what consciousness is. I mean, you in the end of faith, you don't take a clear position on the mind-body problem, but you acknowledge at least its difficulty more than some people who call themselves atheists acknowledge. I mean, there's a tendency for atheists to be materialists in a particularly simple-minded way, and to think that, you know, we figured out why there is subjective experience, and don't you get it? It's just the brain, and I think a lot of times they really haven't thought about it as much as they might. Now, do you have a position on the mind-body problem, or are you just sure it's a problem?
Well, I'm sure it's a problem, yeah, and I'm sure I don't know the answer to it, and I'm reasonably sure all of these people who think they know the answer to it also don't know the answer to it. I mean, I'm close enough to the literature in philosophy and neuroscience.
You won't mention names.
No.
But feel free to. I'll bet some of them have been on Meaning of Life TV.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And I think so I am somewhat agnostic on this, and actually maybe even agnostic in the true sense, in the sense that, you know, I doubt that we're equipped to know ultimately. I think I guess Colin McGinn has really argued for this idea that we just probably are not in a position to resolve this mystery. We may be, but I can't see how. I mean, let's say it is true that consciousness emerges purely out of information processing and in our case, neuronal complexity. You know, you wire together a sufficient number of neurons in the right way, and what was completely unconscious, what had no interior dimension, suddenly lights up, and there's, you know, all of a sudden something that it's like to be that brain. Maybe that's true. You know, let's just stipulate that is in fact a fact. You know, that still seems to me to be the mere declaration of a miracle. I don't understand how that is intelligible to us in the way, and there are many false analogies come rushing in here, like an analogy with heat and and brittleness.
I agree, they're all false.
Yeah.
And it's also not clear why it would be functionally necessary for that to creep into the brain. But this is an argument I've had with Dan Dennett, and it's ultimately, the more you talk about it, the clearer it doesn't get. I mean, consciousness is one of those issues on which people who disagree will disagree forever. Now, you say at one point in the End of Faith, in terms of talking about spirituality and mysticism, there's clearly a sacred dimension to our existence, and coming to terms with it could well be the highest purpose of human life. Now, when religious people think of purpose to human life, they think of something that a God imbued life with. And more generally, when people use the word at all, pretty much they often think of an imbuer. In other words, if a biologist says, well, the purpose of organisms is to get their genes to the next generation, they actually have in mind a process, natural selection, that quote, designed organisms with that goal embedded. Now, when you say this could well be the highest purpose of human life, what does that mean to a self-described atheist?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm using purpose with a capital P in that sense, that it has some kind of teleological implication, or that it need extend beyond this life. But when, you know, we're all trying to live as well as we can, and that the estimation of whether we're succeeding, it has to be measured against some sense of what constitutes a good life. You know, what is the good life? And I think the good life is very clearly becoming as happy and loving and as free of fear as you possibly can, and helping to create a world where people become likewise. I mean, we want well-being, whether we know it or not. We want to feel good, and I don't mean in a trivial sense. I mean, we just want to see. We want the walls of our neurotic self-preoccupation and our all of these constraints upon our feeling well in any given moment. We want those constraints to come down. And so the question is how to bring them down, and what are the psychological and social consequences of them coming down. And I mean, you spoke about self-interest as though it were a counterpoint to mysticism or spirituality, but I think self-interest can also just be reconceived. You know, it's possible to realize that it is in your self-interest to be selfless certainly in certain moments. I mean, that self-interest is, you know, your greatest step toward personal happiness could require some heroic self-sacrifice, you know, and you wouldn't be able to live with yourself if you didn't make that self-sacrifice.
Yeah, so. No, I think the Buddhists are right that they didn't know about natural selection, but the way it does its work, the way it sets our motivational compass is it makes happiness this intrinsically, this kind of vanishing thing. It's the bait that keeps disappearing. So we pursue it, but it doesn't last by nature. And right. you identify spirituality with quote, a happiness that survives frustration of conventional desires. Right. And that's what you have in mind. You're saying that may intrinsically involve a moral life, more moral than we kind of naturally, instinctively pursue.
Yeah.
That would be nice. I would like to think that's true. Now you say that mysticism is rational, like science, and because it is, when you meditate or whatever, you're kind of, well, maybe objectively is a funny word to use in this context, but you're evaluating the nature of experience and so on and coming to conclusions. What about somebody who meditates and feels a very strong sense of connection with a personal God, or maybe a vague quasi-personal God or something? And why isn't that rational, or is it?
Right. Well, one distinction I just would like to bring up because it is relevant here. John Searle, I think, made a great distinction between subjective and objective in epistemological and ontological senses, so that you can be ontologically subjective in the sense that you are the facts you're talking about really are subjective facts. They're not objective facts. You're talking about, you know, what your dream looked like to you. You know, but you can be objective in the way you talk about it epistemologically, which is to not make unfounded claims, to not be driven by, you know, various biases. So I think we can talk about mystical experience objectively. I mean, it is subjectively. Its status is subjective, but we can talk honestly and non-dogmatically and really empirically about it, and we do that inevitably in studying the mind. You know, even in doing functional neuroimaging of various brain states, we have to incorporate people's self-report. You know, a schizophrenic comes into the lab and says, "I'm hearing voices continuously." That is a subjective report about a person's phenomenology, and when you put that person in a brain scanner and find that their auditory cortex is, you know, activated inappropriately, and you correlate that with their report, you haven't made this more objective. I mean, this is science, but you're still using subjectivity as part of your apparatus.
You are, but I mean, ultimately, when you tell me that the subject-object duality collapses when you meditate. To me, all you're saying is this seems really true to me, and I got to take your word for it. And when somebody says, when I meditate, I feel contact with some sort of great being that exudes love or something, right, I'm taking their word for it. I mean,
but that one entails my claim is purely about the character of my experience. The other claim is metaphysics.
Well, but you ultimately reach metaphysical conclusions about the nature of consciousness and its connection to so-called objective reality.
Well, no, I'm not drawing any conclusions about the relationship of consciousness and the brain or what's true of the universe. I'm saying that this sense that we are separate from the sphere of our experience, that there's a thinker of our thoughts, as opposed to just thoughts arising in consciousness. That sense is vulnerable to inquiry, and when you inquire in a certain way, that feeling actually disappears. But I'm not claiming that you can then conclude from that experience that there's just the one mind, of the universe, and you have merged with it, as many mystics do.
You then proceed on the assumption that you have found out something true about the actual nature of consciousness.
Yeah, well, as experience. I mean, for instance, I could tell you an experiment. This hasn't been done, to my knowledge, but I can tell you an experiment that would either make my claim seem plausible or not, and you couldn't use this experiment with the person who says, I'm in contact with God. I mean, if, for instance, we found the neural correlates of self-consciousness, so we got people in MRI scanners, and we made them self-conscious by telling them that people were looking at them. We could see your face now. We've got 100 people in the lab, and we're all looking at the pores on your nose, and you found some way of making self-conscious people feel exquisitely self-conscious in that context, right? And then you bring in meditators who say, well, I can lose my sense of self-consciousness. I know what it's like to be self-conscious, but you can stare at my face all you want. I can drop that, and I can tell you when I'm dropping it. I can tell you those intervals where I lost that feeling of self-consciousness. If we could find the neural locus of self-consciousness, we would see, brain-dependent changes or brain-correlated changes. And that could then make sense in the same way that a schizophrenic who says he's hearing voices, it makes sense when you see what's going on in the auditory cortex. It lends credence to his subjective claims. But you bring a Christian in there who says, I'm sure that Jesus was born of a virgin because I was sitting in prayer and I saw Jesus and I saw, I got the whole image that authenticated to me that the Bible is perfectly true in every word. You need not necessarily doubt the character of their experience, but the claims they're making about reality are completely unlinked to any empirical method you would use to authenticate those claims.
I mean, that's a somewhat more specific religion claim than I had in mind for the hypothetical person. But anyway, on the subject of religion, you're kind of hard on religion, I'm sure you'll admit. Yeah. You call it the one species of human ignorance that will not admit of even the possibility of correction. You complain that it exhibits no progress. You write, if religion addresses a genuine sphere of human understanding and human necessity, then it should be susceptible to progress. Its doctrine should become more useful rather than less. Well, I'd argue there has been a certain kind of progress in broad swaths of religious tradition. I mean, on the kind of scientific front. The Catholic Church finally did get around to apologizing to Galileo. Took a while.
Yeah. But 300 years.
Well, these things take a while to settle. But a lot of traditions, a lot of parts of Christianity have taken account of, geological and biological truth to some extent. They acknowledge the truth of evolution. On the kind of moral front, there's been the evolution of the doctrine, certainly not subscribed to by all Christians, but the idea that you don't have to be a Christian to be saved. And actually, it turns out that official Catholic doctrine, apparently, is that you can be an atheist and be saved. Mm-hmm. Now that I would call a kind of moral progress. Things like, the decline of kind of animal sacrifice even. I mean, right. Do you acknowledge any degree of improvement? You actually write as if you don't. You say it will not admit of even the possibility of correction.
Well, I think it's that has to be put in context, that particular line. I admit that for instance, in the West, Christianity has been moderated considerably. I mean, we are no longer burning heretics alive on our street corners, but we were doing this for 500 years in Europe under the aegis of Christianity. And it's a good thing. It's good that we have changed in that way. But the thing to credit for that is not religion itself. It's not like people just started somehow finding reasons to moderate their behavior in the Bible. Reading the Bible more closely doesn't get you religious moderation. It doesn't get you an openness to stem cell research or gay marriage or whatever else comes.
No, the reality that intrudes from. Yeah, is what does it. I mean, but that's facts about the environment. I mean, that's a good thing. If the system is amenable to change via facts coming in from the environment.
Well, it's amenable to change under considerable duress.
There are
I mean,
constraints.
yeah, I mean, there's really been, a collision between religion and science and religion and secular politics, and the collision, we're living through the collision in the States now. And so it's not, I don't think you should, I mean, one line I have in The End of Faith is that the doors leading out of religious literalism don't open from the inside. I mean, they're always kicked open by the outside, by secularism, by tensions with the world, by the realization that now we understand the nervous system, and demonic possession is not the best diagnosis of your child's epilepsy. Epilepsy is, so the moment we understand epilepsy, the good doctors of the church stop giving these diagnoses and stop trying to drive out demons for the most part.
You could say some of the same thing about medicine itself and even about science. I mean, Thomas Kuhn made the point that the way new scientific paradigms come into being is actually not that the adherents of the old paradigms come to see the truth of the new paradigm. They just die.
Right.
And young people who came of age as the new paradigm was coalescing are become the new generation of scientists who accept quantum physics and realize that Newtonian physics alone won't get it. So I mean, look, religion is definitely more constrained by its history than science. It seems to be right as if there's no hope of progress within it, and ultimately that matters in terms of what you're going to try to do about the world, whether there is hope for productive change within a religious framework or there is not.
Yeah, well, it's not that there's no hope for progress in the world, but I think the hope lies in a truly open-ended human conversation, which requires of all parties that they have their beliefs about the world and their behavior open to being modified by new evidence and new argument. A new piece of data emerges, for instance, that AIDS is really spread by sexual activity. That acknowledging that fact is in fundamental contrast with the dogma of Catholicism that contraception use is sinful. So you have there's no reconciling these two things, and the Vatican and the Catholic Church generally, to its discredit, has been very slow to give way in the face of this truth. And so you have Catholic ministers in sub-Saharan Africa, where 3 to 4 million people die every year from AIDS, literally preaching the sinfulness of condom use in villages where the only information about condom use is the representation of the ministry. So I think this is, I've said before, I think this is genocidal stupidity, and we respect it. There's some criticism of it, but we respect it to the degree that it's, everyone needs to be free to believe what they believe about God, and this is the Christian church after all. If this were a secular institution doing this, I mean, there would be criminal charges brought against it. I mean, it would be really resisted by people, because it is just it's incredibly exploitative of people's ignorance, and it leads to death. So. I think, so here's a case study. Let's say this dogma really gets rewritten in the next 10 years. Let's say the Pope announces, we had it wrong. Condom use is actually part of the holy office of the Catholic faith now, and you must use condoms at every opportunity. So who are we going to credit for that? Catholicism? The fact that it took decades of this promulgation of human misery and criticism from op-ed writers in the New York Times, or are we going to credit the fact that once again science and secularism and basic common sense has won an inch of ground from religious dogmatism?
Okay, you touched on something there. You are, a lot of people condemn religious extremism. You condemn religious moderates as well. And in a certain sense, tolerance. Something you said in one of your books is, given the link between belief and action, it is clear that we can no more tolerate a diversity of religious beliefs than a diversity of beliefs about epidemiology and basic hygiene. I mean, first of all, this will strike some people as ironic, because surely one thing you don't like about some fundamentalist faiths is that they are intolerant, right? So to embrace intolerance as a doctrine to that degree will strike some people as paradoxical.
Yeah, well, I think that's an artifact of language in a way. I'm calling for the same intolerance that we rather effortlessly display in the face of other consequential irrational behavior. If you have people, it's telling that only that a religion has to be very well subscribed before people take it seriously as a religion. If it's just got 10,000 members, it's a cult, and it's a crazy cult. So it can believe the same kinds of things that religious people believe. It just can have different symbols, different names for its gods, slightly different practices, and everyone looks at it from the outside thinking this is very strange, and if they do anything to tread upon our happiness on the basis of their lunatic beliefs, we're not going to tolerate it. And likewise with other curious things people believe. If we had someone running for public office who was sure that Elvis was still alive, and just expressed this certainty at every opportunity, he would not get very far, and people would tell him why. People would say, listen, Elvis is not still alive. It's irrational to believe it. You have marginalized yourself from our public discourse with this crazy idea, and no, you're not going to sit on the board of directors, and no, you're not going to get into Harvard, if you're, it's just, we exclude people who have high levels of certainty uncoupled to good evidence and good argument, unless these certainties go by the name of religious certainty, unless they're covered by the all-purpose solvent of faith, where people are given permission to believe things strongly without evidence. And that's the double standard I'm talking about.
Because the religious claims are less amenable to empirical evaluation than some other kinds of claims. And there are some religious claims, I think, that you wouldn't rule out entirely. I could construct a conception of a not very personal kind of theism that you would probably not rule out entirely, actually. But when you write, we should no more tolerate a diversity of religious beliefs than whatever. Well, that would rule out that religious belief, and ultimately it sounds to people as if you're saying we should not tolerate any conception of religion other than Sam Harris's, right?
Well, no, it's just we should not tolerate ascendant false certainties. Just look what we have in the Muslim world. It's helpful to talk about specifics. We're confronting in the Muslim world the spectacle of some considerable number of people who really believe that cartoonists should be decapitated for merely depicting the prophet. Okay, this is a religious belief. It's there's no graven images. The prophet is beyond any form of criticism. We're not going to tolerate your drawing the prophet, and if we could, we would kill you for it. Okay, this is believed by God knows how many millions in the Muslim world. It's not, we're not talking about 50,000 people. We're talking about a huge number of people. That's a deal breaker. There is we should not be apologizing for drawing the prophet. We should not be accommodating this true surge of medievalism. I mean, this is not compatible with a global civil society, and we really have to call a spade there. I mean, there is no future in which we have seething hordes of people calling for the deaths of newspaper editors.
Everyone agrees on that, and the disagreement is over what you do about that and how you change people's beliefs. And I guess this is where I question your approach of not just wanting to moderate religious belief, but end it, right? I mean, I'm just wondering how effective your project is. I mean, there's a passage in one of your books where you acknowledge, I think implicitly, that you don't have any credibility with Muslim extremists, because what you say is that the moderates within the Muslim community are going to have to do it. Okay, this transformation to be palatable to Muslims must also appear to come from Muslims themselves. It does not seem much of an exaggeration to say that the fate of civilization lies largely in the hands of moderate Muslims. I have a couple of questions. One is actually how much street cred do moderate Muslims have with extremists? But the other question is, if you're trying to get moderate Muslims to do the work, how much street cred do you have when you come to them and grab them by the shoulders and say, you know, I want you to moderate your religion, and by the way, you're crazy to think that there even is a God. I mean,
Right.
you're going to be completely excluded from their consideration.
Yeah.
And isn't it a little ambitious to hope that we could put an end to theism? I mean, it just seems, well, you understand the question.
Yeah. Well, there's a paradox lurking here, and I haven't quite resolved it. I mean, on the one hand, it's true that the path to genuine secularism has to move through moderation. I mean, I don't think we're going to create 1.4 billion atheists in the Muslim world. So the goal, the short-term goal, has to be religious moderation everywhere. And we have 44% of the American people who think that Jesus is going to come back in the next 50 years. It's a bad idea. It's incompatible with creating a durable civilization, I would argue. We have to find some way of moderating them, too. So yeah, I agree that the goal is to get more moderates, and yet my criticism of moderation still stands, because moderates, for a variety of reasons, don't allow us to criticize fundamentalists to the degree we should.
But you're saying we should not tolerate the beliefs of moderate Muslims.
Yeah, but what form will this intolerance take? It's not going to take the form of the Gulag or passing laws against Islam. Or Christianity.
No, but is it productive to even go around, you know, kind of saying it to them a lot? Don't you get it? You're wrong. There's no God. I mean, well, I just don't see what good comes of it.
Well, you have to pick your moments. I mean, I'm not arguing that everyone should talk the way I talk. I wouldn't want the President of the United States speaking about Islam the way I speak about Islam. That would be a disaster. I probably want him to think about Islam the way I think about Islam, because I think my analysis of it is true. But no, there is a room for artful obfuscation of the issues, perhaps. I mean, there is a room for diplomacy, but the tension here is between, and to speak specifically about Islam, I mean, we need moderate Muslims. We need people who really believe that Osama bin Laden has hijacked a peaceful faith, and we need it to be true that Muslims think that jihad is just an inner struggle and not holy war. Great, we need that. But the reality is that Osama bin Laden is not a marginal figure. He's not the Reverend Jim Jones in the Muslim world. And jihad, historically and textually, is most readily interpreted as holy war, not an inner struggle. And for so-called moderate Muslims to stand up and just deny that, and just say Osama bin Laden is a non-issue and jihad is just a spiritual struggle, that is, an apology for the faith and a genuine moment of dissembling about the true causes of religious violence in the Muslim world. So there's a tension here. We need moderates. But moderates are the ones who are denying the link between religious ideas and violence, which is perfectly apparent.
Okay, on the question of how you would turn extremists into moderates, you have been a little dismissive of what are commonly called the root causes of extremism in the Muslim world. You pretty much dismiss the idea that the problem is humiliation or insults to their dignity. At one point you write that you characterize the conventional view as stressing the collusion of Western powers with corrupt dictatorships, endemic poverty, lack of economic opportunity, so on. You say, I will argue that we can ignore all of these things or treat them only to place them safely on the shelf. In other words, more or less dismiss them. Because the world is filled with poor, uneducated, and exploited peoples who do not commit acts of terrorism. I mean...
And there's another part of that, that it's also filled with middle-class, well-educated,
right,
engineers and architects who fly planes into buildings. Yeah. So it's a perfect association.
As for the first part, and I should stress, these are not the particular root causes I would personally stress, like poverty so much, but there are root causes I would stress. And you're kind of dismissive of root causes, and you say we can dismiss them because the world is full of poor, uneducated people who do not commit acts of terrorism. Well, the world is full of people who smoke cigarettes and don't get lung cancer, right? But you wouldn't deny that smoking causes lung cancer.
No, but this is the problem. I'm all in favor of understanding root causes. I just think that the root causes of certain acts of violence, not all violence, but certain acts of violence, really are right there on the surface, because these people are telling us why they're doing what they're doing. All the variables that in our case, poverty, mistreatment at the hands of powers, etc.
So what are they telling us that is the real cause?
Jihad. I mean, to speak specifically about Islam, we're talking.
Right, but the doctrine of jihad has been on their books forever, and yet there are times when it doesn't surface and times when it does. There must be something that's changing.
Well, yeah, it's the fact that you can't really live in isolation in our world anymore. I mean, the fact that a Muslim will go to Hamburg to find work and live in Hamburg and be confronted with the shocking evidence of sin that is Western culture, find it so spiritually oppressive that he's driven into his insular and an increasingly radicalized Muslim community, spends all day long at his mosque talking about the pleasures that await martyrs in paradise and just the horrors of infidel society, won't look a woman in the eye because it's such a spiritual transgression. And this is Muhammad Atta.
So modernity is kind of the root cause.
Yeah. Well, no, but it's not. It's modernity. Modernity is fine. I mean, there's other problems we can talk about in modernity. But the root cause is, I mean, if you want to ascribe it to humiliation, it is a religious-based humiliation. It is a theological humiliation. These are people who think they have the perfect word of the creator of the universe. They expect their religion to be triumphant in this life. And their societies are foundering because, for a variety of reasons, and testifying to the inadequacy of their worldview at some level. So they're humiliated because they're not in power, and they expect to be in power, and they view all of the inequities in the world through the lens of their religious literalism. Now, if they had a different religious literalism, we wouldn't have a problem. So I mean, one thing I argue is that Islamic fundamentalism is only a problem for us because the fundamentals of Islam are a problem for us. We're not, if Jains were, I mean, Jainism is this religion of India, incredibly peaceful. They're vegetarians. They won't kill a fly. If the Jains were poor and suffering, high levels of illiteracy, et cetera, the Jains would not be practicing suicide bombing because they would be viewing this subjugation through the lens of their Jainism, which, however irrational it might be, it has a very different behavioral and logical consequence.
Well, there are certainly some religious doctrines that are less amenable to radicalization than others, but that's not the same as saying that there are kind of no factors on the ground over which we have control that exert a radicalizing influence, right? And would you accept my point that just the analysis as you do it, you say these can't be the cause because there are people who possess these properties who don't become radicals. Well, that is like saying smoking can't cause cancer because there are smokers who don't get cancer. And you're saying, and then you're in turn saying what you added, which is that then there are affluent, well-educated people who do become terrorists. Well, there are people who have lung cancer who didn't smoke. I mean, all four quadrants are always filled up, and it just seems to me the problem is sufficiently complicated that you need a subtle kind of analysis. I mean, more subtle than sentences like this are.
Well, I see. I don't think it's sufficiently complicated in that we're really talking about the behavioral consequences of ideas. If you believe that it's raining outside, and you don't want to get wet, you're going to reach for an umbrella. And so to ask for, well, what was the proximate cause of your reaching for an umbrella? Well, we could talk neurology, we could talk your upbringing, we could talk, socioeconomics, but the proximate cause is you are convinced it's raining outside and you don't want to get wet. And that, as a first approximation, is a good way to explain your behavior. We have an easily as apparent an explanation of religious violence. I mean, you look at why does someone like...
But what's the explanation?
Well, because these people really believe what they say they believe.
Well, sure they do, but again, this is not the way Islamic doctrine has expressed itself traditionally. And your assertion that all it is kind of the certain aspects of modernity that are encountered in whatever your explanation is, it's just not self-evidently obvious. There are lots of candidates for what forces on the ground are leading to this change. And, it just seems to me it's a complicated...
Well, let me just add one piece here, because I think, and this may be surprising to you, I think the situation would actually be worse if they had better education and more money. And I mean, if Islam was actually as viable in the face of modernity as, secular capitalism, if you could live in the worldview of the Taliban and really become a superpower, that is the worst possible situation. So the idea that somehow, if they only had more money, more stability, more technical progress, more affluence, then these problems would go away. I doubt that highly.
I think a lot of moderate Muslims are in that category, and if you in that category are not moderate, it's true. But a lot of the kind of Pakistani Muslims who send their kids to Oxford and so on, they fly business class. They do business with people who aren't Muslims.
Yeah.
They love people who aren't Muslims because they're getting something out of their relationship with people who aren't Muslims. They feel part of that world. They feel they're getting something out of involvement in that world. And it's possible that if you could give more Muslims that sense, it's at least possible. I think we both agree that they look at the world out there and view it as hostile toward their religion. And the question is, are the forms of hostility that they perceive subject to our successful manipulation in a way that doesn't compromise our own values, kind of inexcusable?
Well, let me just clarify one thing. I'm not talking about all Muslims, and I'm certainly not talking about an ethnicity. I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm talking about ideas. So I'm talking about white kids from Marin County who go to fight with the Taliban, as much as I'm talking about people like Osama bin Laden. And what you're describing there is the moderating virtues of secularism and globalization and just having everyone's culture freely available. The fact that you can go to an Indian restaurant tonight and have Indian food, that has a certain moderating influence upon human consciousness, because it's just, we don't have the right to our provincialism anymore at some level, because everything is in plain view. And that's a good thing, and that should happen to the Muslim world. And we can only hope that it happens as quickly as possible, and that will be part of the mechanism that gives us Muslim moderates. And another piece here that we haven't mentioned, which I think is very important, is the empowerment of women in the Muslim world. I mean, we have 50% of the Muslim world that is living a life of really oppressive subjugation under the edicts of Islam. And it doesn't matter how many women you can stand up in burqas who say they want to be in burqas. I mean, ultimately they're wrong to want to be in burqas. I mean, this is something that I argue in my book. And we have to win a war of ideas with them. And
the women are wrong to think that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think any woman who, I mean, you can raise a child so that at the 16th year of life she will stand up and say, I want to be in a burqa. And I don't think we should take that testimony too seriously, ultimately. I mean,
but everyone has been brought up with something and have been indoctrinated in some sense, including you. I mean, I would also take the view, on behalf of a certain moral relativism, that, everyone I know who's kind of in my shoes, has daughters on the verge of teenagehood, has a certain amount of trepidation because of the nature of modern Western culture. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the teenage years. And some traditional societies, not just Muslim, but traditional societies in various faiths, are set up in a way that those things are less likely to go wrong. And I don't mean I want to move to those places. I just mean I think I should be a little careful. I'm not really in a position to say that they've got everything wrong. I don't support polygamy or anything, but
Well, let's take an extreme, because I'm totally sympathetic with that concern. I don't have kids yet, and so I can only imagine what it's like to be a father of girls, but I can well imagine that your teenage girls are growing up and you see the sexualization of culture, right. And that's problematic, and there's some more or less optimal way to balance this. Personal freedom, not stigmatizing sexuality, and yet also protecting girls from the rapaciousness of the male world, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you have various possible reactions to that. I mean, you have Abercrombie and Fitch that we've learned is designing thong underwear for 8-year-olds, and they get boycotted by the marketplace because that has gone too far. But then you have Mullah Omar over here, who's getting girls stoned to death for fornicating, or even getting raped. I mean, honor killing is really the reductio ad absurdum of that approach to problematizing female sexuality. And I think there's going to be a balance point somewhere, and I just am quite sure that the Islamists of the world, or the Christian fundamentalists, have not found that balance point.
Let me back into kind of this same question about what the ultimate sources of bad behavior are, like violence and so on, by talking about a criticism that you got for your first book, and then you addressed it in the second book, Letter to a Christian Nation, as well as a kind of addendum in your first book. Mm-hmm. It's the Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot question. Mm-hmm. All these people seem to have been more or less atheists. Hitler's religiosity is a little bit disputed, but he certainly wasn't professing Christian faith when he was doing his most horrible things. And the point these people are making, I mean, when you look at it, it's kind of striking. I mean, almost all national political leaders of the 20th century did profess a religious faith clearly. The people I just mentioned account for the overwhelming majority of atrocities inflicted by political leaders on their own people. It seems natural to conclude that the most dangerous thing in the world is an atheist political leader. I mean, just statistically, you seem to be compelled to that conclusion. Now, I know you have answers, right? But it's a notable fact.
Yeah, I just think it's once again it's an artifact of the words we're using. I mean, using a word like atheist, and somehow then imagining that because Stalin was irreligious and an enemy of Christianity, his genocide of his people was somehow caused by his opposition to religion or his lack of faith in God. And I just think that's it's a false.
One needs some explanation of something so statistically improbable that the tiny minority of non-religious political leaders would do almost all of the domestic slaughter done in the 20th century. That is so statistically unlikely that it's not enough to say, I don't think it was their atheism. Well, how do you explain the bizarre statistics there?
Well, I can just see why they did what they did. I mean, they had beliefs that they were quite articulate about, and they were moved by their beliefs. Hitler believed that the Jews were the cause of the downfall of German society, and the Jews were just racial poison and had to be exterminated. And that was so. Now, where did he get that idea? And conveniently for my thesis, you trace that idea back. You find that anti-Semitism is a product of religion. It's a product of Christian fulminating against the Jews for thousands of years. There's the idea that the Jews stand in repudiation of Christ.
But he also wanted to wipe out gypsies and handicapped people. Did he inherit that from Christianity?
Well, no. I mean, there are other kinds of tribal hatreds that come.
But that's my point. It seems to me in that case, nationalism is a more elegant explanation than religion. Fanatical German nationalism accounts for all the people he killed, whereas religion, as an explanation, leaves some of the things still unaccounted for.
No. Well, they're just different. This is not a contradiction. They're just different reasons why people kill people. There's greed too. He wanted a 1,000-year Reich. He wanted to be. There's just megalomaniacal thinking. He wanted to be, the Führer to the entire world. But when you ask, where did anti-Semitism come from? Why is it when the stormtroopers moved into Poland that the Poles so easily set upon their Jewish neighbors and the Latvians and the Lithuanians, and Why is it that people were so gleeful about exterminating the world's Jews? You cannot get anti-Semitism without this history of demonizing Jews.
Then where did the anti-gypsy, if that has no comparable history in religious doctrine? I mean, the question...
No, like, where does racism come from? You know,
well, exactly. You see,
there is tribalism.
Here's the question I'm asking. In cases like this, where it would seem to me like it has more to do with nationalism or other forces, you tend to insist that it's a form of religion.
Well,
but I mean, you're right. And you in addressing this, you say communism of Stalin and Mao was little more than a political religion. At its heart was a rigid ideology. It was cultic. It was irrational.
Right.
Well, just as much as you could say this was a political religion, you could say when religion reaches kind of toxic levels of group cohesion, it is a theological nationalism, okay? And the larger question I'm getting at is, isn't it possible? I mean, my view is religion is actually composed of a lot of parts of human nature. One is this kind of groupishness that can turn aggressive, has to do with lots of other parts, but isn't it possible that religion is just one manifestation of this form of human nature? There are others, such as nationalism. The problem is this part of human nature, and the question of what circumstances excite it, arouse it, is one that isn't fundamentally about religion. And whereas I from your writing, I get the sense that you think a huge majority of the world's problems boil down to religion per se.
Yeah, well, let me reconcile it here, because I think it's easily done. I think the problem is dogma. I think the problem is false certainty that people find incredibly energizing, and false certainties that are immune to criticism because you have some social context in which it has become taboo to criticize these certainties. And when these certainties are ascendant and they are emotionally empowering and they balkanize your world into us-them categories, where you have, in the case of religion, Christians against Muslims against Jews. In the case of politics, you have the true believers of the Reich and everyone else. These divisive certainties, which are immune to criticism, that's the problem. So dogma is the problem, and my argument is just that religion has more than its fair share of dogma. And it's the only case in which dogma is not actually a pejorative word. I mean, we talk about religious dogma as though dogma were a necessary feature of the whole enterprise. And so that's what I find to be so dangerous about religion. And it's also, these are differences between people which they are willing to live and die for in a way that doesn't tend to be true in politics. It can be true in politics, but it's not, it can be true of Red Sox and Yankees fans, but it doesn't tend to be true.
There are uniquely destructive doctrines, such as the idea that if you kill a lot of people, you will get a special place in heaven. I'm not so sure that the afterlife intrinsically is a bad. I mean, I don't know what the scorecard is on how much good has been done by people who thought they would, go to heaven by doing nice things to people as opposed to people, But there are certainly uniquely problematic and toxic religious doctrines. But the question I'm trying to back into is, again, my view, which is just different from yours, I think, that religion is often kind of a mediating variable. It's mediating a part of human nature that is unfortunately excited under certain circumstances. And I'm glad to hear you say that you think it often assumes secular form. I thought, right after 9/11, when for a while you really couldn't question anything George Bush said. I don't know if you remember this, but it was like really unpopular to question that, which I think is an unhealthy situation. I would also say that what you just described as being part of a worldview, us against them, and attributing a kind of unity to them, is something that some people, that's a way that some people characterize George Bush's worldview, including a part of it that I think you buy into, kind of, the idea that the problem is Islamic fascism writ large, as opposed to my view that, if you look at the various Muslims in the different parts of the world who are unhappy, originally their unhappiness was growing out of separate grievances, In Palestine, originally, it was very much an issue about Israel, and it was not very religious 30 or 40 years ago. I don't know if you remember, but the opposition to Israel had much more the character of Arab nationalism 40 years ago than it does now. So anyway, that's. Why don't you say whatever you'd say, and then we can move on? Cause
yeah, I think that it's not. I mean, you can start at it from the other end. You can say, all right, the enemy is not religion. Let's not talk about religion. Let's just talk about evidence and what is rational to believe about the world. Let's just start from first principles, and let's be intellectually honest. And then whenever we encounter people who have bad evidence and bad arguments for their beliefs, we're going to criticize them. I mean, we're not going to admit them to our graduate schools. We're not going to promote them to public office because they're being irrational, and we're going to stigmatize flagrant irrationality. Well, then who are we going to wind up stigmatizing when we do that? We are just going to be blasting religion all day long when we do that, but just by necessity. Because when you hear what religious people think about the world, when you hear that 45% of Americans think Jesus is coming back in 50 years, when you hear that 53% of Americans think the universe is 6,000 years old, and if you did these polls in the Muslim world, we would no doubt get flabbergasting data. You would stand in perpetual criticism of the bogus certainties of the better part of humanity. And the question is, how do you win a war of ideas in the face of that? That's one question. The other question is, what do you do when these certainties are arrayed in such a way that they're causing people to fight over incompatible, religious claims upon real estate, for instance? I mean, the fact that the Jewish settlers, need this real estate because it's been sanctified by the footprints of Abraham, and if we offered to give them British Columbia, they wouldn't take it. They would be free from Muslim hatred, and there'd be great peace. There'd be a great peace dividend born of that, but they wouldn't take it for religious reasons. And so it seems to me that however you want to mince words here, we have a major problem between what's going on under the name of all these rival religious conceptions of the world and the tensions of modernity, and the fact that we are trying to build a global civilization.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree on that. And the question is how you change people's views.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm the first to admit that I am one voice that maybe should not be duplicated too much. I mean, I don't think everyone should speak the way I speak. I'm playing a certain role. Dan Dennett's playing a different role, which I appreciate. I mean, there's a good cop, bad cop routine that I think is appropriate in different contexts. But I think we should be honest about what is reasonable to believe and why actually people do get up in the morning and decide to, kill their daughters for being raped or etc.
Okay. Now, just briefly back to the question of whether religious belief might not be in any sense defensible. You have a kind of a spirituality, an ethic that follows from it, and it has to do with kind of kindness toward people and so on. I mean, what if it is the case that either because of human nature or because of specific people's natures, right, they are not going to be able to lead a very full version of that ethical life unless they have a sense that there's a loving God that wants them to.
Right.
And I kind of think maybe for some people that is the case. I assume, first of all, you wouldn't say that's a validation of the belief. Does it affect the way we should talk about that belief? I mean, do we really need a scorched earth policy against all forms of religious belief? I mean, you would, or to take another example, I'm sure a lot of money went to victims of Hurricane Katrina that was raised in churches, synagogues, and mosques, or whatever, and probably some of it just would not have been raised. Such is human nature, for better or worse. How do you respond when people point these things out?
Well, I just don't think we're in a position to know, because it's almost like asking. It's almost like looking at the fact that most of the people who have ever done construction work, in this city, for instance, believed in God. So now who's going to build all the buildings if we just created a lot of atheists? I mean,
I think that's a little different. I mean, I don't think they were doing it out of their religious. They were getting paid by the hour, right?
Yeah,
but
in the larger sense, there really has been nobody else to do the job on so many fronts. I mean, everyone. It's like, one example I give is that everything that was accomplished by human beings prior to 1950 was accomplished by people who didn't understand anything about DNA and the molecular basis of human inheritance. That's not an argument for saying a misunderstanding of biology is a good thing to perpetuate. I think that children can be raised to, I mean, one argument I have against religion is that it gives good people bad reasons to be good when good reasons are actually available. I mean, we can find good reasons to care about people after a hurricane happens in New Orleans, or people starving in Africa.
Although by your own account, the good reasons aren't kind of readily available. What I mean by that is, in your case, your spiritually based ethic has required an immense investment of time, like a total of 2 years just meditating, more or less, and discipline. And one question is, how realistic is it to expect everyone? Well, that's the first. I have 2 questions. The first one is, how realistic is it to expect everyone to do that, if that's what it takes to do it in a kind of secular, rational way?
Well, see, that's not required to give you ethics. I mean, I think there's an interesting phenomenological conversation to be had about the relationship between spirituality and ethics. But, I didn't get my ethics out of meditation initially. It's not like I was, raping and killing and lying and stealing, and then I started meditating and I realized I shouldn't do that.
Has it made you more faithful to your ethics?
I think so, but I mean, for instance, I took a course as a freshman in college that the total content of which was answering this question: is it ever okay to lie? It was just all about telling the truth and whether white lies were ever justified, and that was a formative conversation for me. And from that moment forward, I had a view of lying that gave me my ethical code about truth telling, with regard to truth telling, which really just transformed my behavior. I can't remember who I was before I walked in the door of that seminar. It's like, I don't know how much I lied, I don't know what I thought about lying, but I know that after 10 weeks of thinking about lying and its consequences in my day-to-day life and the kind of world I want to live in, I knew that lying, but for the most extreme circumstances, the Anne Frank circumstance, like is this little Jewish girl in your house? Telling the truth is a deep ethical imperative, I think, and you can come to that in a perfectly secular way. And I think secular, we could have a secular articulation of really everything that we think may be necessary in religion. I mean, let's say we need ritual, for instance. Let's say ritual is doing something that is absolutely essential psychologically and socially for us. There's no reason why we can't have rituals that are divested of bullshit. That don't require a down payment of irrational false claims to certainty at the door.
Is ritual, in some sense, always arbitrary or irrational? I mean, there's no reason to do any of that. I mean,
Well, no, not necessarily, because like I got married not that long ago. Given my religious heterodoxy, I couldn't just pick off the shelf, a Buddhist ritual or a Christian ritual, and so we had to craft a secular ritual that was not embarrassing, and it turned out to be, exactly what we had hoped for. There was a way to bring everyone in our lives together and kind of mark this moment with some profundity that didn't require that anyone think they knew something that they didn't know about the universe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. My second question about this is, I think I kind of agree with you that if the world is around and in good shape 100 years from now, it will probably be the case that there is certainly among educated people, a spiritually based ethic that is well, certainly not based on old-fashioned personal theism, a theism based on a personal deity, certainly not based on conventional conceptions of the Abrahamic God. That's kind of my guess. Mm-hmm. And that it will have to do with some of with this spiritual disciplines such as meditation and philosophical insights such as you find in some of the Eastern traditions and so on. But there's also the question of how you get there. And I think I already see tell me if I'm wrong, I see more and more Christians kind of talking like Buddhists. I mean, more, and you hear more and more about kind of living in the moment. Some of them are doing meditation. And I can imagine people being slowly weaned off of some of their more archaic beliefs in a way that would ultimately be more graceful than kind of grabbing them by the shoulders and saying, don't you realize how irrational old-fashioned religion is? And you know, even within Islam, you have a Sufi tradition, which at least in some of its modern variants is very kind of meditated, not in all, and not in all of its historical manifestations. But I mean, isn't it possible we want to kind of encourage gradual evolution and do a little less yelling about how crazy they are?
Yeah, well, I think again, there are roles for different voices. You know, I think that's a good thing, and I mean, I stand in a unique position now because I receive, you know, thousands of emails in response to my very radical criticism of religion, and I can see the spectrum of effects. I mean, there are the people who are just frankly offended and think I'm the Antichrist, and then there are people who can't buy my whole argument hook, line, and sinker, but they think, you know, now I recognize some of the liabilities of the religious polarization of our world in a way that I didn't, and so there's a modulated effect even of a very extreme and radical criticism, which I'm noticing. But yeah, again, I think, you know, I hope you're right about 100 years from now that we have
Actually, I didn't predict it. I just said if we're around, and the world is in good shape.
I agree. Yeah, I think it's, you know, having 100 years where we are this polarized along religious lines, and we have this many people looking forward to the end of the world for eschatological reasons. I think it's hard to imagine we're going to get many centuries into the future.
Now let me just quickly ask you a couple of questions. One about whether sometimes religious belief is kind of not right, but closer to the truth than a lot of forms of atheism. And let me give you this parallel. You're probably familiar with the famous encounter between you know, this theologian Paley in the 18th century, and the whole blind watchmaker thing, where he said, look, you look at an animal, it's like it has the intricacy of a watch. If you found a watch, you would know that it had been created for a purpose. You know, and these animals, they do things, they have goals, you know, there must be a God that created them. Now, suppose somebody had come along and said, no, you're wrong. Animals, they were not created by anything. They've always been there. They have no purpose. There's nothing they're designed to do. Okay? Now, as it turns out, the truth is somewhere in between. Natural selection created them and actually did imbue them with kind of purposes. So they have a creator, they have designer, they have purposes. Who would you say was closer to the truth at that point about animals? Somebody, the hardcore atheist, who would have said they're completely without design and purpose, or Paley?
Well, I think when you unpack what people actually mean, religious people actually mean by design, by designer and by purpose, I think the atheist still has to win that argument, and certainly has to win it now in the 21st century. I mean, one thing I think that is doing a lot of diabolical work in the dialogue among people who think religion and science are compatible is a failure to make this distinction. What religious people do, and they can be scientists, you know, they can be Francis Collins, when they look at a piece of scientific data, they ask the wrong question about it. They ask, is this compatible with a belief in a Christian God, say? So they'll look at a piece of data like 99% of all the species that have ever lived are now extinct. Okay, and they look at this and they say, well, is this compatible with the God of the Bible? Well, of course it is. You know, the answer to that question is always yes, because who can understand the will of God? Maybe he wanted to destroy 99% of his products for, you know, reasons we can't fathom, etc. But if you ask yourself, is this fact suggestive of the existence of an omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly benevolent God? I mean, would any person in his right mind look at the fact that 99% of all the creatures that have ever been created are now extinct? You know, that 99% of the products have failed. Would this lead you to believe that if there is a God, he's omnipotent? Well, no. Or would this lead you to believe that there is a perfectly benevolent God? No. And why would you even think there was a God on the basis of this? And it's true with everything that religious people rationalize. It's true with the Holocaust. Is the Holocaust compatible with God? Yes. I mean, maybe he hated the Jews. Maybe he wanted the Nazis to have a circumstance where they could sin with all their free will. Okay, that you can always rationalize those things, but you would never look at the Holocaust and say, this convinces me that there is a perfectly benevolent, perfectly powerful, all-knowing God looking out for us. And that's a distinction that never gets...
I totally accept the argument against an omnipotent and benevolent God, but the question I'm asking is, if two people are addressing the question of whether, in this case, they were addressing the question of, do individual organisms, are they products of, in any sense, design? Do they in any sense have a creator? Do they in any sense have a purpose? One person said yes, one person said no. At the level of the questions as I've asked them, the person who was right was the religious person. And I guess the analogy I'm pointing to is if you look at not individual animals, but look at natural selection itself and ask yourself, does it look as if it was moving towards something that is best explained by it in some sense having a design and a purpose? In other words, it was very likely to create self-reflective intelligence, which would make moral progress or something. Let's take that version of the argument, which I'm actually sympathetic to. Right. That's not to say it was created by something omnipotent and benevolent, because clearly there's been too much suffering for that to have been the case. But the assertion, the suspicion that this historical process is in some sense a product of design, in some sense has a purpose. If it turns out to be the case that it did, even in the kind of sense that animals turned out to have a designer, which in other words maybe it was just designed by a process, but a process of selective retention that whatever. Won't it be, if we found that out someday, wouldn't you be hard-pressed to say who was closer to the truth? Some theologian or Dan Dennett. Who had been closer to the truth about the historical process, if it turns out to, in some sense, have a creator and designer, which is one reason I'm kind of reluctant to dismiss theologians and reluctant to embrace hardcore atheism, I guess.
Well, are you saying that it may turn out that there was a creator who, in advance, conceived of a purpose for creation and then implemented it through natural selection?
Could be some conscious thing, put specks of bacteria on Earth knowing that it would blossom through a process of natural selection. Could conceivably be some process of meta-natural selection. There are actually some cosmologies compatible with this that involve the creation of new universes through black holes or something. I'm just saying, see, the thing is, I think you actually agree with me that a lot of atheists have an unjustifiably constricted view of the realm of metaphysical possibility. And I guess I'm asking you if they don't have an unnecessarily constricted view of the realm of, in some sense, theological possibility. I mean, we don't know, what natural selection, why it started.
Yeah, well, but see, I'm content to leave it there. I don't know, and we don't know, and yet I feel no temptation to fill that gap with any of these clearly these imaginary friends that we as cultures have created.
You mean personal gods?
Yeah, and so that seems to me clearly wrong. As wrong gets. I mean, it's wrong to put Zeus there. It's wrong to put Baal there, and it's wrong to put Jehovah there. And so let's say I'm completely open-minded about the future deliverances of science. I mean, if we find that we are running as a simulation on an alien supercomputer, if that's the story, the answer at the back of the book of nature, wow, that's a big surprise, and it's going to have to be compatible with the data of our world. Yeah, and it would be, and it's not a theistic God, but even that would be an intelligent designer.
A quick related question on the subject of death. There's a philosopher at Princeton named Mark Johnston who's developed a very interesting argument that I think in some ways you'd be sympathetic with based on your spirituality. It's an argument for the afterlife, but not in the sense that I, Bob, shows up somewhere after I'm dead, but in the sense that if you think truly about your connection of other people, it gets back to your idea that the sense we have of the narrowness of our own consciousness and sense of self is kind of illusory. And there's actually more in the way of true contact with other things, other people. he's saying if you think truly about that and strip yourself of the natural illusion, it makes sense kind of to think you should connect your own identity with posterity in a new way. You should think that if when I die someone else is born somewhere, that's really enough because I am them and they are me. And it's a secular argument about an afterlife, and it's rigorous, whatever you think of it. And again, I would kind of say, if he's right, and you probably would not exclude the possibility until you'd read the argument, I think, given its nature, isn't someone who has a more naive view of the afterlife, but that and derives some hope and confidence from that, and confronts death with some degree of equanimity, aren't they closer to the truth, if he's right, than somebody who goes, I just can't, death, it's just the end, I can't bear it, it's hopeless, it's freaking me out.
Right.
Is that, you would not concede that? Or?
Well, yeah, I would concede that facing death with equanimity at some level is the goal for all of us. I mean, we want to find out how it is possible to be truly happy in light of the reality of this world, which is, and one of those realities is death. And worse than death, in my mind, is the fact that everyone we love dies before us. I mean, if you just live long enough, you are going to lose everyone you love in this world. And that is, in some sense, even more horrible and mystifying to me than just the fact that, I'm going to die at some point. We go to sleep I mean, the irony is we're actually not afraid to lose our experience of the world. We all happily go to sleep every night, and we just surrender consciousness, or at least it seems we surrender consciousness. And we're not holding on to the bed sheets at the last moment, saying, "Don't let me go, don't let me go."
And this captures a lot of the spirit of Mark's argument. And if you said to somebody, "Would you rather die tonight after you go to sleep, or wake up with complete amnesia and be moved to another house?" They would say, "I'll take the amnesia scenario."
Right.
And he's kind of saying, well, that is the situation,
right,
in some very true sense, which I think you might actually sympathize with. So you might accept that not only should it be our goal to confront death with equanimity, but if we really understand the metaphysics, maybe that's an appropriate way to confront death.
Yeah. Well, Lucretius got at this point where he said, where death is, I am not, and where I am, death is not. I mean, we kind of, if death really is the extinction of consciousness, then we're never going to meet it. We're just going to pass. It's just the obverse of our situation. And I don't know what death is. I mean, I'm actually open to far more spookier ideas of rebirth and reincarnation.
Trot some out. What's the spookiest thing you're willing to countenance? Or weirdest thing?
This guy Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, a psychiatrist who's done. He's got this kind of lone operation studying evidence of reincarnation and rebirth and xenoglossy, unlearned language, where a kid at age 2 will start speaking in a dialect of Bengali that no one for 2,000 miles has spoken. This could all be elaborate scientific fraud. I don't know. I don't know him. I don't know. I mean, I'm not close to his data. But if it's not fraud, it's very interesting and spooky stuff. And I'm just open-minded on that. I'm open-minded on psychic phenomena, I mean, to the consternation of many atheist critics of my book. If telepathy is a reality, I'm interested to see the data. I mean, maybe it's bogus, but there seems to be some data there that has been sufficiently stigmatized that no one really wants to pay attention to it. I don't know what is true of these situations.
I mean, if it turned out that minds exuded some kind of new waveform we haven't detected, and some people can pick up on it and read minds or something, that actually wouldn't violate any of the basic tenets of science. I mean, at one point we didn't know about electromagnetic waves. And the truth is, science itself is implying weirder things than that. I mean, these physics, these ideas of time travel, ideas where causality can work backwards as well as forward. So my mind's pretty open. I guess the last question is, in terms of confronting something like that, has atheism come at a cost for you? Were you brought up religiously? Did you used to have a more comforting idea of these things?
Well, I would take issue with the idea that the common religious framework is comforting. It's not comforting for me to realize that the difference between calling God by the right name or the wrong name is a difference that matters for eternity, and people will really be languishing in hell because of having made the wrong decision. It's, when you look at the details of what religious people believe, there is much that is comforting. Perhaps the idea that you're going to be reunited with your family and your pets in heaven is comforting to people, I'm sure. But I think the real comfort comes from being able, in the present moment, to transcend your feelings of fear and anxiety and grief and depression. I mean, what we need is a way of realizing our situation in the world, moment to moment, which frees us of the imperatives of a rising mental discomfort and physical discomfort. I mean, physical pain is a reality, and until science cures it, which may in fact happen, and that would be great. We all live with the day-to-day possibility of suddenly feeling tremendous pain in the body. Now the question is it possible to be at all okay with that, before the morphine hits? And to my mind, meditation reveals that it actually is possible. I mean, it's actually possible to be writhing in agony, or to be, incredibly nauseated, or with something really that is classically unfulfilling as an experience, and to recognize that awareness itself is kind of intrinsically at peace. And it's not necessarily easy to do, but it's possible to do. And I think maybe one day we'll get drugs that will allow us to do it very easily. Maybe there'll be a mindfulness pill that will just give you an ability to just kind of drop your clinging to your experience, if only for a moment. But I mean, this story is for a completed science of the mind to write, I think. And a completed science of the mind will tell us, I'm not saying we'll ever get there, but 1,000 years from now, it'll tell us whether human minds are permeable to each other beyond space and time. And I mean, who knows what the final story is? But it's not going to be a matter of dogmatism comforting us in the end, I think.
Okay. So I mean, you view a lot of conventional religious worldviews as much terrorizing as comforting. But you're not one of these atheists who escaped from such an upbringing.
No, I'm not reacting to, the nuns who beat me with a ruler, or there was none of that. So.
And you find yourself able to confront death with, I don't know, how does it seem to you? You're too young to worry about it a whole lot, but.
Well, I worry my fair share, and people close to me have died, and I know what it's like to have someone in your life just disappear, and it's mind-boggling that everyone's going to disappear. I mean, I don't know how to put a cheerful face on that. I mean, it is a and the fact that it can happen suddenly and inexplicably and in ways that are in themselves horrible. I mean, it's just my real problem is the fact that it happens so much of the time unnecessarily based on religious conflict in the world, and that we have people in the world who think that death at the right moment is just the best thing, it's the career opportunity to end all career opportunities, and they seek it out. I mean, this is speaking specifically of jihadists. That's what has animated me in making the noises I make. But
I guess the good news is there's some hope in how many adherents of religions that subscribe to the idea of an afterlife or heaven have actually lived their lives in ways that didn't really take the idea that I mean, there's almost, it seems to me good news that almost no one actually welcomes death when you come down to it. Yeah. And certainly not you, apparently, or me. Well, anyway, death is always a natural note to end on. Right. So here I'll thank you for